Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 22nd of January. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is the Full Scottish. This afternoon, we have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 333 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our two excellent guests, and then together we will look in a little more depth at the past week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. An advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that caution and slow decision-making over whether to send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine is costing lives. Mikhailo Podolyak tweeted on Saturday his frustration at global indecision over arms supply to Ukraine. Today's indecision is killing more of our people. Every day of delay is the death of Ukrainians. Think faster, he tweeted. Baltic countries have told Germany to send the tanks now to Ukraine after perceived heel-dragging by the government in Berlin. The Latvian Foreign Minister, Edgar Rinkēvičs, tweeted that they are needed to stop Russian aggression. The same tweet was put out by his counterparts in Estonia and Lithuania. Joe Biden told reporters after an event on Friday night that Ukraine is going to get all the help they need in response to a question about the tanks. The German Defence Minister, Boris Pistorius, said that despite heightened expectations, we still cannot say when a decision will be taken and what that decision will be when it comes to the Leopard tank. Germany has said it is doing a stocktake of its current tank numbers ahead of a possible decision. Some 50 nations agreed on Friday to provide Kyiv with billions of dollars worth of military hardware, including armoured vehicles and munitions needed to push back Russian forces. A tearful Volodymyr Zelensky attended a memorial service on Saturday to commemorate 7 senior Interior Ministry officials killed in a helicopter crash on Wednesday, according to Reuters. The Interior Minister, Denis Monarchsky, his deputy and 5 others were killed when their helicopter plummeted amid fog into a nursery on the eastern outskirts of Kyiv. Including those on the ground, a total of 14 people were killed. Agence France-Presse has reported the Russian army is saying its troops have launched an offensive in Zaporizhia in the southeast of Ukraine. Russian forces claimed to have taken more advantageous lines and positions during the assault. A 17-year-old boy has been injured by Russian shelling of Sumy Oblast in Ukraine. Russian attacks on Friday killed 1 person in Kharkiv, 3 people in Donetsk, and 1 person in Zaporizhia. 4 were killed in Kherson, according to President Zelensky's office. And the war in Ukraine is in a state of deadlock, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. In an intelligence update, it said that there was a possibility of Russian advances around the heavily contested city of Bakhmut in the Donbass, but otherwise little movement. And a little after 9 this morning, the Ministry of Defence provided a further update on the situation in Ukraine. They said that on the 17th of January, the Russian Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, announced plans for major changes to the structure of the Russian armed forces to be implemented between now and 2026. This included an increase to 1.5 million personnel. That's an 11% increase on top of the previously announced expansion to 1.35 million. Shoigu also announced the re-establishment of Moscow and Leningrad military districts, a partial return to Soviet-era organisation of forces in western Russia. A new army corps is to be established in Karelia, near the Finnish border. And the Ministry of Defence says that Shoigu's plans signal that the Russian leadership highly likely assess that an enhanced conventional military threat will endure for many years beyond the current Ukraine war. However, Russia will likely struggle to staff and equip this planned expansion. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined today, as I say, by 2 excellent guests. Martyn was first elected in 1999 to represent his hometown of Linlithgow and neighbouring villages on West Lothian Council for 16 years. He became a Member of Parliament for Linlithgow and East Falkirk at the general election in May 2015, and he was re-elected at the Snap general election in June 2016 and at the Brexit general election in December 2019. Prior to his political career, Martyn worked for the Bank of Scotland as a personal banking manager. Martyn, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Not bad. I'm on the recovery from a bout of ill health at the end of last year and an emergency operation. So if I could just indulge by expressing my public thanks to everyone in the Scottish NHS for the wonderful work they did to get me back on my feet. And everything worked wonderfully apart from the patient. So there's a lesson there for all of us to get us checked out more regularly.
It's a great message, and we're delighted that you're here to deliver it this afternoon, Martyn. It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us. And we're also joined today by Hugh Marshall. Hugh was the founder of the National Wales, Anwen Wales, and is now running Talking Wales, which is a new national news service for Wales. Hugh's an expert in digital strategy, content creation and marketing support, and he's a regular contributor to Broadcasting Scotland, providing the view from Cymru. Hugh, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
I think there's a bit of a theme developing here. I myself am also recovering. I had an emergency laparotomy 2 weeks ago to repair a hernia. So I'd like to, again, give my gratitude to the Welsh NHS. And I must say, it was quite an eye-opener being in hospital for over a week and seeing what's actually going on within hospital in Wales. And it is quite startling.
Thank you, Hugh. Similarly, we're delighted that we are able to join us this afternoon. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to stay with the Ukraine story update for a moment because, as I was saying, Germany is now facing a backlash from allies over its reluctance to supply Leopard 2 tanks to bolster Ukraine's fighting capacity. On Friday, 50 countries agreed to provide Kyiv with billions of dollars worth of hardware, including armoured vehicles, but the German Defence Minister, Boris Pistorius, said that we still cannot say when a decision will be taken or what that decision will be. At the same time, the presidential advisor, Mikhailo Podolak, has tweeted saying, "Today's indecision is killing more of our people. Every day of delay is the death of Ukrainians. Think faster." And then we saw, in a rare public criticism of Germany, foreign ministers from Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania calling on Germany to provide Leopard tanks to Ukraine now. And that was followed up by a statement tweeted by the Latvian Foreign Minister, Edgar Rinkēvičs. Berlin has been hesitant to send Leopards or allow other countries to transfer them to Kyiv, with reports earlier in the week saying it would agree to do so only if the US provided its tanks as well. And at the moment, Washington has said that providing Abrams tanks to Ukraine is not feasible, and they've been citing difficulties in training crews and maintaining the tanks. So firstly, Martyn, why do you think Berlin is being so hesitant as in the face of this changing direction of travel with regard to the provision of heavy main battle tanks to Ukraine?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest. I'm not sure why they are. Only the Germans can probably give us that answer. What worries me in the whole process that we're hearing here is that it perhaps gives comfort to Putin and his allies that maybe the West isn't as united as it should be in defending the rights to self-determination of a small European nation. And that's the bit that worries me most. Why they're hesitant, I don't know. But obviously everybody will be concerned about the escalation of a wider war. But, this is where it's happening now, and this is where the aid is required.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, broadening this out a little bit, obviously during the war to date, 33 days so far, Europe and NATO forces have been hesitant to escalate the size and scale and lethality of the hardware that they're providing to Ukraine, citing concerns about risks to the wider Europe and wider NATO, and perhaps being targeted in retaliation by Russia. But how do we balance that risk against the risk to Ukrainian civilians, who, after all, are now being targeted by Russia, including apparently with missiles of the size and scale which in a normal conflict, these missiles would be used to blow up things the size of aircraft carriers. How do we go about balancing out the risks to the wider population with the risks to Ukrainian civilians who are being targeted and killed?
I think it's really interesting in this conflict. Obviously, the Second World War, is a distant memory, but it's still within living memory of many people, and it's hard to imagine during a conflict like that people would still have been sort of getting oil and gas from Germany, whilst they were actually at war with with the Allies. And I think that's what's weird here is the way that capitalism, to a certain extent, has sort of exerted its control here, because obviously Russia, the big threat to Russia is their economy, because obviously they're very reliant on exports of oil and gas to generate their revenues. Germany are obviously far more reliant on those have been more reliant on those sources of energy, and it is a tough one, because obviously because the UK have sent, I think, 12 Challenger tanks of the 300 that Ukraine are asking for. The US, it was quite interesting. I was reading a piece about the Abrams tanks, about how they're fueled differently. They're not suited to the terrain that's needed in Ukraine and and the Russian border. Whereas Challengers and the Leopard tanks are designed for that kind of territory. So obviously there's a lot of brinkmanship going on here. Obviously you've got countries like Poland and Finland who want to send their Leopards, but because of the agreement with purchasing from Germany, they're not allowed to do that without that permission. And obviously there's been a change in the defence ministry as well in Germany. So I think I think definitely I need to read up more on sort of internal German politics, but it is harder for Germany because obviously they're historically, and also where they're located within Europe. But there are no easy answers. But at the end of the day, we can't let Russia carry on behaving as they are. And there has to come a conclusion, and it has to come for me with some sort of defeat of Russia from that perspective.
Thanks, Hugh. Some great perspectives there from you and from Martyn as well. Thank you. But let's move on from Ukraine now, because Nadym Zahawi was battling to save his political career last night after he finally admitted reaching a tax settlement with HM Revenue and Customs following an error over a controversial multi-million-pound shareholding in the polling company YouGov. In a very carefully worded statement, Zahawi appeared to confirm that HMRC had carried out an investigation into his finances whilst he was serving as Chancellor last summer. Zahawi, who is now Tory party chairman, said that the tax authority had concluded that he had made a careless but not deliberate mistake. So that I could focus on my life as a public servant, I chose to settle the matter and pay what they said was due, which was the right thing to do, he stated. Tax experts said the statement was a tacit acknowledgement that Zahawi had paid a penalty. Zahawi's tax affairs were thrown into the spotlight last summer when he was appointed Chancellor by Boris Johnson, the day before Johnson was eventually forced to resign. The Observer reported that civil servants in the Cabinet Office's Propriety and Ethics team had alerted Johnson to an HMRC red flag over Zahawi before his appointment, but that flag had been ignored. It was estimated by the think tank Tax Policy Associates that Zahawi may have avoided £3.7 million in capital gains tax on the sale of the shares. Yesterday's statement immediately set off new demands for Britain's most senior civil servant and Parliament Standards Commissioner to launch separate investigations into the affair, after questions over whether Zahawi had made the correct declarations to officials and to Parliament concerning his financial interests. Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, is facing calls to oversee an investigation into whether Zahawi should have declared any links relating to YouGov or Balsure, its holding company, under the Ministerial Code. The SNP has called for an independent inquiry, with Kirsty Blackman MP saying it beggars belief that the former Tory Chancellor with responsibility for the UK's tax system has reportedly had to pay a penalty to HMRC as part of a multi-million-pound settlement. This is after him calling legitimate questions about his tax affairs smears last year. How can anyone trust a word the Tories say? It is simply untenable for the Prime Minister to keep Tory chair Nadym Zahawi as a member of the government. He should sack him from his cabinet. This latest scandal underlines just how utterly broken the Westminster system is. Only with independence can Scotland shake off the corrupt Westminster system for good. Several senior ministers had defended Zahawi, including the Prime Minister. At PMQs on Wednesday, Sunak said that Zahawi had already addressed this matter in full, and there's nothing more that I can add. The admission raises questions for Sunak over what he knew about the settlement and when. And that, of course, comes with the Prime Minister already under pressure after being fined by the police again, this time for not wearing a seatbelt. The Labour Party has reported former Prime Minister Johnson to the Parliamentary Commission for Standards. That comes following allegations that the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, helped Johnson to guarantee a loan of up to £800,000 just weeks before Sharp was selected for his current job at the BBC. Labour Chair Annalise Dodds has written to Daniel Greenberg, who is about to become the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, raising concerns about the reports, and has suggested it may have been a breach of the Code of Conduct. A spokesman for Johnson has told the newspapers that the reporting is rubbish and that Richard Sharp has never given any financial advice to Boris Johnson, nor has Mr Johnson sought any financial advice from him. So, we have a current Prime Minister fined twice this year by the police, something that hasn't happened for hundreds of years, a past Chancellor forgetting to pay more than £3 million in taxes, a current Chancellor who in 2018 breached anti-money laundering rules by forgetting to declare a multi-million-pound purchase of 7 luxury flats, and that's not forgetting, of course, that in 2010 Jeremy Hunt accused football fans of playing a part in the death of the 96 people who were killed at Hillsborough. He did subsequently apologise to the City of Liverpool and to the families. We also have a Justice Secretary being investigated in at least 8 cases of bullying at work, a Home Secretary who had to resign earlier this year for breaking the ministerial code, and a past Prime Minister who has been raising hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds in personal loans. So, Martyn, where to start with this story? Thinking firstly of Nadim Zahawi, if this reporting that we've been hearing now and the growing reporting is true, and as reported, the Cabinet Office raised a red flag about Zahawi's tax affairs before he was appointed Chancellor, why do you think Number 10 went ahead with his appointment? Is it simply hubris? These people don't think that the law applies to them if they're a Tory minister.
I think you've made a very good point there. There's certainly a big element of that. It's almost as if they're trolling us because Nadim Zahawi's official position in the cabinet is the minister without portfolio. Now, you can't think of anything more incredulous given that it's his financial portfolio that's now got him into trouble. I could add more, and you've got the PPE scandal, as well, with a VIP hotline and the Michelle Moan stuff. There's a pattern that just seeps right throughout the entire Tory party, and it just leaves a sickening taste in any decent person's mouth. We need complete and open transparency in all these matters, and as far as Zahawi's concerned, his position is completely untenable. He cannot possibly survive more than a week or so.
Thanks, Martyn. That presupposes the next question I had, which was, do you think he's going to have to resign? So thank you for answering 2 questions. Hugh, have you been surprised to discover that the Tory chair, who famously used public money to warm the stables of his particularly chilly horses, and who last year said, I've always declared my financial interests and paid my taxes in the UK, are you surprised that in fact he's now had to cough up several £1 million he owed in taxes to the UK after a dispute with the revenue over an offshore family trust?
Not at all. It beggars belief how the Conservatives, who were once seen as a party of respectability, the rapid decline since Boris Johnson in particular is astonishing. And you can see this across politics across the board. Has happened with the Republican Party, with Trump in America, where just lying, sleaze, corruption. It's just across the board. And now it seems to be something it's a different thing on a daily basis that journalists are uncovering. And I think credit needs to be given to the journalists at the Times who uncovered the story. And obviously, we don't forget that when Zahawi was confronted with this, first thing he did was threaten them with legal action, which again questions the fact that whether he knew or not, whether what he was doing was wrong. But no, I'm not surprised, and it's just sad, and it almost feels like they know that they're going to lose the next election, and they're just trying to get away with as much as they can before they go into oblivion.
Thanks, Hugh. And to the point you're making about identifying those who've been so important in bringing this story to light, we should also mention again Dan Needle, who's a former senior lawyer and now works for an organisation called Tax Policy Associates, and he has been the one who's been investigating since the summer. And thankfully, it's now been picked up by The Guardian and The Times and others, and the Sunday Times this morning on their front page. But let's move on now if we can. We'll stay with Westminster politics because Rishi Sunak is facing mounting opposition to his government's plans to review or revoke some 4,000 pieces of EU origin legislation that have roots in the UK's membership of the EU, and to do so by the end of 2023. Legislation to enact these plans, the retained EU Law Bill, returned to the Commons on Wednesday this week, but is attracting a growing chorus of complaints from business groups, legal experts, civil servants, trade unions, and conservation groups. However, leading Conservative Brexiteers like Jacob Rees-Mogg say the bill is essential in order to purge the UK statute book of unwanted EU regulations in the wake of the Brexit referendum in 2016. This bill requires that all EU-derived secondary legislation be reviewed by Whitehall departments by the end of the year. This covers a huge number of rules and regulations, from the Working Time Directive, which regulates employment conditions, to rules governing chemical usage and conservation areas. But at the moment, ministers still cannot say exactly how many EU laws are covered by this bill. And that is causing consternation. Originally, they thought there were 2,400 retained EU laws, but the National Archives recently found 1,400 more. The bill also includes a sunset clause, which means that any legislation not converted into UK law or revoked by the end of 2023 will automatically drop off the statute book. Because of the speed at which the government wants to proceed with the bill, it will create significant uncertainty for industry, employers, regulators and investors. EU-derived laws cover a myriad of areas, including data protection, cybersecurity, consumer rights, intellectual property, tax, public procurement, insolvency, agency workers, working time, equal pay, construction, real estates and commercial agents. The British Chambers of Commerce has called for the deadline for the review to be pushed back to 2026, after a survey of its members found that half of all companies said deregulation was either a low priority or not a priority at all, and only 4% said they understood the retained law bill. As I said, Clause 15 of the bill enables ministers or devolved authorities to revoke any secondary retained EU legislation and replace it with such provision as the relevant national authority considers to be appropriate, and to achieve the same or similar objectives. Ruth Fox of the Hansard Society, a think tank specialising in legislation, described this as handing ministers a do anything we want power and of diminishing the role of Parliament. Downing Street cannot afford to be seen to be backpedalling on this totemic Brexit bill and remains committed to the 2023 sunset clause for now at least. With sensitive negotiations underway with Brussels over the Northern Ireland Protocol, government insiders admit they cannot fight a battle with Tory Eurosceptics on two fronts. Sunak is keen for ministers to start delivering on early reforms to EU legislation. The matter was discussed in Cabinet on Tuesday this week, particularly in areas such as digital technology, farming and the creative sectors. However, some senior government figures have admitted that the House of Lords could insert amendments to slow the process down and delay the 23 deadline, and that might be a convenient excuse for Downing Street to put on the brakes. So, Martyn, after that lengthy introduction, my apologies, I'm going to ask a dumb question because that's often the way of getting to the middle, getting to the heart of what's going on. Martyn, what's going on here?
Well, that's a very good question to ask. I mean, we're on unprecedented is a word we throw about probably all too often, but this week we've had more unprecedented actions than I've seen in many weeks before. The reality is we don't actually know the exact number of pieces of legislation and rules that are going to be affected. That's just a disaster waiting to happen. There will be unintended consequences. But we should perhaps be more worried by the intended consequences, and the very limited information that came out in the government's briefing note was that it would deal with regulatory divergence through the UK Internal Market Act. So they're quite clearly behind this as an assault on our devolved parliaments. And we should be extremely concerned that ministerial powers can be exercised by diktat without any proper scrutiny. And there's I learned a new phrase that I hadn't perhaps encountered before, and perhaps other people haven't either. And I throw down change by inaction. Because of the sunset clause being so widespread, we could all be running around looking at the few things that they're telling us are changing, but things that they don't change drop off the books by default, and then they can act by diktat. That is a very frightening scenario. And that is what I think is happening. It's going to be impossible to look at the number of pieces of legislation before the end of this year.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, following on from that, do you think, is there any prospect of this plan, if I can call it that, working in any sensible way when the government doesn't even know how much secondary legislation this will affect?
And this is something that was raised, during the Brexit campaign by people in Wales about how this would impact on devolution. Obviously, those who were for Brexit were saying, it was all to do about, bringing government back close to the people. But it's clear, that part of the work here was to try and undermine devolution. And again, it's the problem in Wales is, we did vote by a small majority for Brexit. Around, I think it was 80,000 was the majority. And I'm sure that, if that vote was held tomorrow, it would be a very different result. Now the people know more about the people who were behind the campaign. But, as you were mentioning, things like the environmental matters, these things need scrutiny. And that's one of the issues why the Senedd is seeking to expand its numbers, because, when it was set up, it doesn't have the capacity to scrutinise these kind of issues and matters. But it's a very serious issue. But again, it's just being, it's being fobbed off as always, it's nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. But that's the way this current government operates, unfortunately.
Thanks, Hugh. We'll be looking at devolution in a moment as it happens. You won't be surprised to hear. But Martyn, thinking now about the politics of this a little bit more, and in particular the position that Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister, finds himself in, do you think, are we now at risk of being dragged back into the chaos of yet more civil war between the right-wing faction of the Tory party and the extremely right-wing faction of the Tory party?
That's an ongoing contest that they have. Although I've witnessed in the years that I've been in Parliament the morph from right wing, mostly sane individuals, slowly but surely over a few years into what is full on UKIP and is fast becoming the BNP. There are very few of the sort of centre right Tories left. Their party has been hijacked by the nutters, and it is the nutters that are now running the UK. And we need to get out of that mess as soon as we possibly can, because it's clearly not going to get any better.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, is this also perhaps a desperate last-ditch attempt by Brexiteers to try to deliver something, anything, out of Brexit, even if the thing they're delivering is going to be more chaos, more uncertainty, and more economic harm? Sorry, Hugh, that was for you. Can you hear me, Hugh?
Yeah, sorry, just froze up for a second there. Well, yeah, clearly, as you just said, the Conservative Party has been hijacked by this, I don't know, lunatic fringe. We hear more from people like Lee Anderson and Michael Fabricant these days than we do from, previously from, the more moderate people within the Conservative Party. And as you say, they're still trying to appeal to this sort of this mythical red wall of voters who were traditionally Labour supporting, but obviously didn't like the EU and were sold this lie of mass immigration was going to threaten their communities and their identities. it is a problem. Like I say, the next general election can't come soon enough. But my concern is, obviously, anything by the Tories, but I'm not sure how much better a Labour Party under Keir Starmer is going to perform than this current lot, unfortunately.
Thanks, Hugh. Now, as I said, we're going to look at devolution now, and we'll get a great perspective now, both from Scotland and from Cymru, because the Scottish Government has called on its UK counterpart to revoke its order blocking transgender legislation passed by Holyrood, indicating that perhaps the Scottish Government wants to avoid a legal fight that would delay its implementation. The announcement from the Scottish Secretary is harmful to trans people who have waited long enough for improvements, Shona Robeson, Scotland's Social Justice Secretary, said. Being forced to consider the prospect of legal action before these changes are enacted only raises further uncertainty. Rishi Sunak's government in London sparked a constitutional conflict with the administration at Holyrood when his Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, said he would invoke Section 35 of the Scotland Act to stop the legislation. Jack says that the bill will cut across UK-wide equalities legislation. Our First Minister in Scotland described this move as a full frontal attack on devolution and accused the Secretary of State for Scotland of acting like a Governor-General. She said Alistair Jack's decision to block her government's gender recognition law marked a new and more dangerous phase for devolution. That's hours after he refused an invitation from the Holyrood Equalities Committee to come to Edinburgh and discuss the legislation. In a speech to the Business for Scotland annual dinner in Glasgow on Thursday, the First Minister said, "The Tories have broken cover. The stealth attacks have been joined by a full frontal assault. The decision of the Tory government to strike down a law clearly within the devolved competence, which was passed overwhelmingly in the Scottish Parliament and which was supported by MSPs from all parties." Ms Sturgeon added, "Through his actions, the UK government," said the Secretary of State for Scotland, "is demonstrating he is sadly not interested in working in partnership. He's decided to act like a Governor-General, treating the Scottish Parliament as a body subordinate to him and deciding which democratic decisions and laws to veto." Also on Thursday, Alistair Jack told the Holyrood Equalities Committee, which scrutinised the gender bill last year, that he was unable to attend its meeting next Tuesday. He suggested that Kemi Badenoch, the UK Equalities Minister, was the more appropriate minister to invite, and the committee has done so. Immediately after he refused, Holyrood's Constitution Committee wrote to Alistair Jack, asking him to give evidence on the 26th of January at a session about the constitutional implications of the Section 35 order. So, Martyn, firstly, during the week, the First Minister has described Alistair Union Jack of acting like a Governor-General in deciding which Scottish laws he would like to veto. And of course, earlier this week, we saw the Labour MSP, Paul Sweeney, saying, "It feels like a politically malicious act, and I think it's about time that Viceroy Jack got back in his box." So are the First Minister and Paul Sweeney correct? Alistair Jack is behaving like a British Empire Governor-General, or perhaps a Viceroy?
Yeah, yes, they are correct. Although, as a keen student of history, I can't imagine many of those viceroys and governor generals of days gone by being as appalling in their responses at a dispatch box as we saw with Jack. I mean, he couldn't answer any of the basic questions about what the effect would be on gender recognition certificates, how people would get one, what would be the impact on the Equalities Act. He kept defending himself by hiding behind a piece of his legal advice, which he said answered the questions but hadn't even been published at that point. I mean, it's absolute. And when it was published, didn't answer the questions. No surprises there. Perhaps that's why he couldn't answer them. His briefing didn't tell him, and he was dreadful. And the worrying thing is now that this Rubicon has been crossed, this unprecedented action to invoke the first Section 35, and the main grounds is the one-size-fits-all unionism of the effect of divergent systems on the UK. Well, how many other divergent decisions are now going to be subject to the Jack veto? And that is the bit that we really need to be worried about. It is a slippery slope. It may even be a fast track towards one-size-fits-all unionism, and that is very scary indeed.
Thanks, Martin. And it crosses my mind that we mentioned the Internal Markets Act as well a moment ago. And I've certainly been wondering in the back of my mind if we're going to see a competition between Alistair Jack trying to use Section 35 and Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, trying to use the Internal Markets Act. But Hugh, turning to you, Mark Drakeford has condemned the UK government moves to block the Scottish law which is to make it easier to change gender. The Labour First Minister in Wales said the moves to block the law sets a very dangerous precedent for devolution. In the Senate on Tuesday, Mr Drakeford suggested that his ministers might support the Scottish government should the matter reach the Supreme Court. Mr Drakeford said the UK government's decision to use powers that have never been used in the history of devolution is a very dangerous moment. I agree with the First Minister of Scotland that this could be a very slippery slope indeed. Mr Drakeford said it was part of a wider pattern from the UK government, citing recent breaches of the Sewell Convention, which is an agreement for Westminster not to legislate in devolved areas without the agreement of the Senedd first. So, Hugh, what is the perspective from Wales with regard to what the Westminster government is doing to other devolved administrations?
Yeah. We've covered this already to a certain extent. It was good to hear Mark Drakeford make his statement, and also the fact that he was supportive of the legislation that the SNP government was putting through. But I don't know if you saw Nicola Sturgeon was on Laura Kuenssberg's show this morning, and it was clear, Nicola Sturgeon spoke very, very well, explaining that this isn't, the Section 35 isn't the route in order to challenge the issue. So again, that they're using a sledgehammer to try and smash a nut, and obviously it's all to do with with trying to harm devolution. Even though it was devolution has been in place for a number of years, and the Conservatives in Wales say they support devolution. They're clearly anything they can do to undermine it. They're going to try and do it. And I don't know if you've seen Andrew R.T. Davis, who's the leader of the Conservatives in Wales. His Twitter activity has been quite bizarre of late, because people have been questioning whether it's him who's talking or whether it's one of his SPADs, special advisors. But again, even the Conservative Party within Wales is taking quite an extreme approach to this. I think the problem in Wales is Mark Drakeford and the Welsh Labour government pointing the finger towards Westminster, yet that they're happy to be part of a unionist sort of settlement that leaves us at the whim of English voters to decide who governs over Wales and Scotland, and in a number of key areas. So it is frustrating, but it's good to see that Labour are starting to think more independently, even if they're not thinking from an independence perspective.
That's a great way of putting it, Hugh. Thank you. And Martyn, is this process that's playing out now, is this uncovering or laying bare once again one of the problems with devolution, is that power that's devolved is power retained by Westminster, and that means in this case a straight white upper class farmer from Dumfriesshire, who had a majority of 1,800 at the last general election, can wield a sledgehammer, as Hugh calls it, and overrule the decision of the majority of the MSPs who sit at Holyrood.
Yeah, very much so. And we saw from his performance at the dispatch box that he has no sympathy for the whole concept of devolution, nor any understanding of its historical origins, because I need to check the wording in Hansard to get this right, but basically he claimed that powers were given to Scotland in the devolved settlement, which clearly isn't the basis that it was done. It's actually the opposite. Powers were retained is what actually happened in this. Those things that were specified were kept at Westminster, and everything else was in the competence of Holyrood. And Holyrood has acted within its competence. It, having looked at the rules of a Section 35 order, which I have to say prior to last week I hadn't looked at the detail of. I think probably half the country's been Googling and checking the library briefings on what it actually is, and there are set criteria for its use. And clearly on this occasion, it doesn't meet those criteria, and anyone can look those up. So we have a battle that needs fought, and I think they've picked this battle for very, very cynical reasons. One, they don't like devolution, and here's a chance to go back with it. They picked an issue that's very emotive, and it has people misinformed and divisive. So they're hoping that we get bogged down into the issue rather than the principle of the devolution. And it's taken the Scottish Parliament 6 years to get this piece of legislation through the statute book. It is not rash or inconsiderate, and yet Jack comes along at the 11th hour after the event and strikes it down just to create mayhem and throw red meat out to the Tory backbenchers that are looking for a fight.
Thanks, Martyn. I think that analysis certainly strikes a chord with people watching what's happening both in Scotland and in Wales. But let's move on now, because King Charles III is reportedly to put refugees and the NHS at the heart of a diverse coronation that will bring the nation together in a 3-day celebration designed to reflect modern multicultural Britain. The King is understood to have endorsed the inclusion of refugee choirs, NHS choirs, LGBTQ+ singing groups and deaf singing choirs, as well as the virtual choir made up of singers from across the Commonwealth. The Telegraph reports that, as a lover of both music and dance, Charles is a huge fan of choral music and helped the Duke and Duchess of Sussex find the gospel choir that performed at their wedding in 2018. As I say, they will be accompanied by a virtual choir featuring singers from across the Commonwealth as the King signals his commitment to the international family of 56 nations. A coronation big lunch at which friends and neighbours will join forces to celebrate at street parties will take place on the same date. It'll be followed by the Big Help Out, a volunteer scheme designed in tribute to His Majesty's many decades of public service and reflecting his desire to create lasting change. People will be encouraged to join local volunteer projects on Bank Holiday Monday, dedicating a few hours to help create a coronation legacy. A Buckingham Palace source said the 3-day weekend would represent Britain as it is today, while maintaining the best traditions of pomp and pageantry for which we are rightly known. Apparently, it has been designed to ensure that everyone who wants to get involved has the opportunity to do so. A royal source said the coronation needs to be majestic but inclusive to reflect a diverse modern Britain. Michelle Donnellan, the Conservative Culture Secretary, said that the coronation of the King and the Queen Consort was a huge milestone in the history of the UK and the Commonwealth. The weekend of events will bring people together to celebrate our monarchy and the mixture of tradition and modernity, culture and community that makes our country great, she said. The event will be a spectacle that both the palace and the government hope will showcase something called UK PLC. So, Martyn, first of all, is this spectacle being used as a dead cat thrown onto the table to distract the media and others from, and I apologise for using these words, Meghan and Harry?
Well, I think it will be used for a whole range of purposes. I think we need to watch very carefully the statements government slips out while the public are distracted by all the pomp and ceremony, and that applies to people who are not royalists as well, because they'll be looking perhaps with outrage at the sheer cost of even a relatively budget coronation during a cost of living crisis. So we need to be very aware of what else is done while our attention is being diverted. I think that's perhaps the bigger factor there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martyn. Hugh, I'm interested a little bit in Michelle Donnellan's words, her mixture of tradition and modernity, culture and community. And I was wondering, is this the tradition that prime ministers don't break the law, and the modernity that they do? Is this the culture that in a pandemic crisis, the most important thing is that Tory friends and family have the chance to make a profit? And the community, where it is that, as at Friday, 216,255 people have died in the UK from COVID. That's about 320 deaths per 100,000 of the UK population. And just for comparison, the comparative number, so it's 320 in the UK, the comparative number for Germany is 200, for Finland is 150, For Australia, it's 71, and for Japan, it's 51.
But don't forget that world beating, getting the jabs into arms. It's all been a PR exercise, and that's the thing that's distasteful. I've mentioned this before that during COVID, I lost my mother. She didn't die due to COVID, but I had to watch her funeral on a recording, a streamed recording, 6 hours after the event because I was respecting the rules because she was 170 miles away, and at the time, travel wasn't allowed. But I think this is one of the last. It's the last hurrah of the British sort of state and the empire. King Charles, obviously, he's been frustrated that he's been held up from being king for so long. And I think he's determined to sort of put himself in the limelight, and have his day of glory. The reality is, younger generation just simply aren't interested in the royal family. What's happened with Harry and Meghan, I think it's turned a lot of people against the royal family. Obviously, if you're in the bunting game, then it's going to be a good weekend for you. And there was mentioned this week as well, with Charles wants to be more charitable about the revenues from the Crown Estate, being used for public good. I think the revenues from the Crown Estate are devolved in Scotland, that they're not in Wales. So I think there's about £700 million in Wales that that could be coming into the treasury in Wales that currently isn't. And there's a huge offshore wind farm in the Celtic Sea, which is predicted to potentially generate £2 to £3 billion in revenue. And of course, because the seabed, as we all know, belongs to the king, that money currently will be going in his direction. And again, it's another example of, it'll be a Welsh resource. It's in the sea off the Welsh coast, and that the revenues from that will be going, if Charles gets his way, will be going to the UK Treasury, not the Treasury in Wales. But it's sad. There's an opportunity here for Charles to sort of, to put a line in the sand and say, right, the old days of the monarchy are over. We're downscaling. It's going to be a far, slimmed down version of what used to be. Times have moved on. The world has changed. But I think Charles, he is of that generation. He's, an old-fashioned traditionalist. And, sadly, you can see from the clips that have been, I think he's a bit of an egotist as well. And he's going to want his day in the sun.
Thanks, Hugh, and in particular, thank you for now putting in my brain the image of Baroness Michelle Mone of Mayfair getting into the bunting game, reusing the tens of millions of pounds of the PPE which she and her husband have supplied to the UK government, and which cannot be used because they're not fit for purpose. Thank you for positing that vision in my head. But Martyn, coming back to the coronation big lunch. If memory serves me correctly, last summer during the Jubilee, there was only one big lunch with friends and neighbours joining forces to celebrate at street parties. There was only one in the whole of Scotland. Are you hearing from your constituents in West Lothian a desire to participate in a coronation big lunch in 2023?
Well, I have to be honest and say no. That doesn't probably surprise you. I think, there's an element that people might watch what's on the TV out of curiosity, but I'm not hearing any desire to rush out and celebrate extravagantly or even modestly. It's something that is happening. It's not something that people are really participative in.
Absolutely, thank you, Martyn. And Hugh, thinking again about the from a Welsh perspective, the very speedy appointment of a new Prince and Princess of Wales, which followed on from the coronation, from the taking of office of King Charles. There was some sense that there was at least disquiet in Wales with the speed of that appointment and the manner in which it was done. a few months later, what now is the view from Wales of the appearance of a new Prince and Princess of Wales?
Yeah. Obviously, I think the fact that Charles, the investiture in Carnarvon back in 1969, and people may not be aware of the history around the coronation in Carnarvon. There was attempts made to stop the coronation. A couple of people lost their lives placing explosives on the rail line that was going to be carrying Charles to Carnarvon. So there's a history there, and there's an element of bitterness and resentment, I suppose. Again, having this title imposed on the people of Wales, and again, this was an opportunity for Charles to sort of listen to the people, have a dialogue, and say, well, what do the people of Wales, want and think? And he obviously made the decision very, very quickly, without any discussion. I think the one difference, I think, is with William and Kate, is that they have lived in Wales. They lived on Sir Fôn and Anglesey when he was based there in the RAF. So there is that connection, but again, it was a short stint that they spent in the country. I just think people are just bored, and I think what's interesting in Wales is, I live in an old coal mining community in the valleys in Wales, and it's in these areas that the royal family still have that support, is with that older generation, the post-war generation. And you see, over the years when there have been activities, you've seen the street parties and the bunting, but every year there is a different, jubilee or whatever, you're seeing less and less of it. So I think that generation is basically dying out. The younger generation, they're not interested, and I think they are more engaged. And I think people don't realise the power of Harry and Meghan and the impact they're having on the royal family, especially with the younger generation. I think people are just seeing it, not sympathising with them in particular, but just seeing the absurdity of having a family who are just born into riches to rule over us and somehow supposed to be better than us. They're just people at the end of the day, and it's just it's just nonsense. In this day and age, that we still have a royal family.
Thanks, Hugh, and thank you in particular. You've given me a fantastic segue from that item into our final item this afternoon. Who would imagine that demographics in the context of the royal family and the Constitution would have the same effect as they're having on the campaign for Scottish independence, where the demographics are particularly clear. But support for Scottish independence is now at its second highest level ever reached, according to an exclusive new polling series commissioned by The National. The new polls put support for yes at 54% of those likely to vote, once don't knows were excluded. No was at 46% after don't knows were excluded. That's nearly a complete reversal of the 2014 result. And it also means that yes has been in the lead in 6 polls since the Supreme Court ruled that Scotland could not hold an independence referendum without the permission of the UK government. This polling comes amid a row after the UK government took the unprecedented step of blocking Scotland's transgender law reforms. The polling expert, Professor John Curtis of Strathclyde University, said it was too soon to tell whether the UK government's intervention had any impact on Scots' voting intentions, but he suggested that the results suggest that a reported drop-off in yes support which followed the Supreme Court ruling may not be the case. He said, there isn't any evidence here that this is any clear indication that the GRR row has pushed support for independence up any higher. What it does do is suggest that maybe we can doubt whether or not the impact of the Supreme Court judgment has dissipated in the way that some other polls had suggested. Rona Mackay, who's the SNP MSP for Bearsden and Strathkelvin, said that Westminster's handling of the economy and its Trump-like denial of Scottish democracy was pushing voters to yes. She told The National, it's clear people in Scotland have had enough of opposition parties' Trump-like denial of Scottish democracy and the damage caused by ever-tightening Westminster control. Both Labour and the Tories are now Brexit parties, committed to keeping Scotland out of both the EU and the huge single market, which means the economy and living standards are being hit hard. Westminster is undermining both the Scottish Parliament and our economy, which is why more and more people believe it is right that decisions about Scotland should be made by the people who live here, so that we can build a fairer and more prosperous independent country. The Scottish Greens MSP Ross Greer said it was no surprise more Scots than ever were backing independence. He said, Westminster is running roughshod over the Scottish Parliament, overturning legislation passed by a supermajority of MSPs and openly boasting about the contempt they hold for Scottish democracy. So it's no surprise to see a growing number of people saying that Scotland's future needs to be in Scotland's hands. So, Martyn, firstly, thinking about the politics of this, do you think our Westminster politicians and their Scottish branch managers, are they actually much bothered about polling in Scotland now, given the consistent direction of travel?
I don't think they're particularly bothered about what we think or do in Scotland, other than their ability to get hold of our assets. So I think we can do pretty much electorally where they've written Scotland off, and it's questions how they hold it. Our challenge is how we turn these polls into independence, and it's pretty clear at the moment we're looking at an electoral route. Now, the polls give us a lot of encouragement, but we've got to convince a lot more people. What the polls do tell us, though, of course, is that we are particularly strong with the younger voter. And we know that the younger voter is less likely to turn out and vote in a parliamentary election than the older voter. So we've got a big deal of work to do to make sure that whenever the event, whichever event it is, comes along, that we get these younger supporters out. And this is going to be compounded because one of the other Westminster atrocities that they've committed is this voter ID, which comes in May this year, and we'll see the first early symptoms of that in the English council elections in May, which I think will understate the chaos and damage that it will do, because we all know that at local elections older people are more likely to vote and they're also more likely to hold ID. So we've got to make sure that everyone that's on our side gets a valid form of ID that will allow them to vote, but that's particularly the case with our younger cohort.
That's a very good point, Martyn, and something that we're going to have to be seeing addressed on the doorsteps in advance of any elections run from Westminster. That's a very good point. And Hugh, finally with you, reflecting a little bit more, we're seeing a direction of travel amongst polling in Scotland. We've seen a direction of travel in polling in Wales as well. And reflecting on this, do you think that this direction of travel in polling, is it being driven by a negative force, a revulsion to Westminster and Westminster politicians, or is it being driven instead by a positive case for independence or greater devolution or more responsibility and power being exercised by voters who live in Wales and live in Scotland?
I think it's most definitely the first point is, Westminster's such a mess now that previously you could have argued that, the Westminster knows what they're doing and, they're best placed to run things. But, in recent, and, it's almost like a weekly basis, getting worse and worse. So that is going to drive, that kind of attitude. There was a recent poll last couple of weeks that showed that support for independence in Wales had gone down slightly, but polling in Wales is so sporadic and small, it's difficult to judge. So it's somewhere between 25% and 30% is what they think. And again, as you were saying, is the skew with the younger generation is huge. It's the over 60s, is massively against it. The under 20s are massively in support of it. And I think what we're seeing with voter ID stuff as well is what's going to be really key here is that, the messaging to get people out there, regardless of people's party politics. We need to get campaigns going on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. Young people are to make the nation, but also the importance of voting to be able to make change.
Thanks, Hugh. As ever, demographics tell us all we need to know. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to continue to develop the station. Our programmes will always be free to view, but But if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 to enable us to employ more staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who's signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, and you can find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, please like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland. Click on the wee bell. We will be back tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching us this afternoon, and of course, I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guests, Martyn Day, MP, and Hugh Marshall. Thank you both, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you. Diolch.
On this day in 1924, Ramsay MacDonald became Britain's first Labour Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister from a working class background and one of the very few without a university education. If you open your window just now, you can probably hear the sound of Mr. MacDonald spinning furiously in his grave and spiny churchyard in Elgin, having heard what his successors have been up to. Bye-bye.